The late afternoon heat hung over the Texas dirt like a heavy, wet shroud. Inside the red dust arena, silence pressed down like a storm about to break. The clapping had died minutes ago. Now, the only sound was the dry rustle of dust swirling in the air, and the furious snorting of a creature that looked like it had clawed its way out of hell. Midnight, a jet-black stallion with muscles carved from fire and rage, charged against the chains wrapped around him. His neck gleamed with sweat, and his hooves struck the ground with the fury of a war drum. In the bleachers, wide-brimmed hats tilted down to mask the looks of fear and disbelief. 10 of the state's top horsemen had already failed. One walked away with a dislocated shoulder. Another left in tears. Each had tried to lay a hand on Midnight, and each had been thrown back like rag dolls. The horse had become a legend, untouched, unbroken, and unbreakable. And still, Silas Vane Delacroix stood by the arena gate, smirking behind his tailored gray suit, the dust refusing to settle on his polished boots. "I'll put $5 million on it," Silas had declared that morning, his voice echoing off the wooden stands. "No man alive will lay a hand on that horse." It wasn't just a bet, it was a performance. A spectacle for the rich, the bored, and the desperate. Silas had money to burn, and pride to protect. Midnight was his trophy, his curse, and his circus act, all wrapped into one wild breathing storm of muscle and madness. But then, the crowd began to murmur. From the far end of the arena, a man in a faded denim shirt and worn-out boots stepped through the dust, his hat low, his gait slow but steady. Boone Casket didn't look like much, sun-worn skin, a face carved from old grief, and eyes that hadn't seen joy in decades. No one recognized him right away. But Sheriff McCorkle squinted hard from the stands, leaned toward the arena fence, and muttered under his breath, "I'll be damned." Boone didn't speak. He didn't flinch when Midnight reared up, chains clanking like broken bells. The stallion screamed, high, violent, feral. But Boone just stood there, hands at his sides, eyes locked with the beast's. A silence spread through the arena again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was curiosity. Something in the air shifted. The horse had stopped pawing at the ground. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. Silas Delacroix leaned forward, his smile faltering. For the first time all day, he didn't look so sure of himself. Boone stepped farther into the arena, slow and deliberate, each boot sinking slightly into the churned dirt. The only thing louder than the wind brushing through the bleachers was the blood pounding in the ears of everyone watching. Midnight didn't move. His head tilted just an inch, ears flicking back and forth like he was trying to hear something beneath the silence. Boone stopped about 12 feet away from the stallion and simply stood. No ropes, no tools, no fear. It was like watching an old gunslinger stare down a loaded revolver and dare it to fire. People whispered in disbelief. "Who is that? Is he drunk? That man's got a death wish." Sheriff McCorkle leaned against the railing, arms crossed. He hadn't seen Boone Casket in nearly 2 decades, but time hadn't done much to soften him. There was something about Boone that made folks uneasy, not violent, but haunted. Like he'd lived through something most people wouldn't survive, and somehow came out quieter because of it. Midnight finally took a step forward, testing the earth like he was stepping into another world. His muscles twitched. A low, threatening snort rolled from his chest. He was still dangerous, deadly, even, but there was hesitation now. Boone didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and hollow as dried-out riverbeds, stayed locked on the animal like he could see something no one else could. And maybe he could. Boone had been a trainer once. A damn good one. Before the fire. Before the silence. Before the boy. A flash crossed Boone's face, something between pain and memory. For just a second, he wasn't in the arena anymore. He was back on his old ranch, 10 years ago, standing in the ash of what used to be a barn. The smell of smoke still lived somewhere in his lungs. So did the scream. The boy's name was Dusty Jude, his son, and the last horse Boone had touched was the one that ran out of that fire without him. The stallion took another step, this time closer. Boone slowly lowered his hand, palm out, fingers open. No commands, no tricks, just quiet. The entire arena held its breath. Even Silas Delacroix, who now had his arms crossed tightly across his chest, had stopped smirking. Something unnatural was happening here. Unnatural only because it felt real. Midnight didn't charge. He didn't rear. He didn't bolt. He simply stared back. Then, in one motion so slow it could have been missed, Midnight lowered his head just an inch, subtle, cautious, like a question was being asked without words. Boone took one step forward. The chains rattled. The air thickened. And everyone knew something ancient was waking up between them. You could have heard a pin drop. Boone stood there, hand outstretched, eyes never leaving the beast in front of him. Midnight's breath came out slow, heavy, clouds of heat rising from his flaring nostrils. His front hoof scraped the dirt once, twice, then stopped. It wasn't submission. It was recognition. The crowd, frozen in place, didn't dare speak. They weren't watching a man tame a horse. They were watching two ghosts find each other in the middle of a battlefield. From the bleachers, Odessa Delacroix, Silas's 12-year-old granddaughter, leaned forward, her small fingers curled tight around the rusting rail. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed not on Midnight, but on Boone. She whispered, barely loud enough for her grandfather to hear. "He knows him." Silas glanced down at her, expression darkening. "Nonsense," he hissed. "The man's a nobody." But Odessa wasn't wrong. Boone had known a horse like this once. A stallion called Iron Riddle, wild, brilliant, broken. Riddle had saved Boone's life during a flash flood when he was just a boy. They'd grown up together. Riddle had died the night of the fire, just like Dusty. But now, Boone felt it, deep in his bones. This wasn't just another horse. Midnight carried something else in his eyes. Something Boone had buried for good. Boone's fingers trembled, just once, before he steadied them again. His hand remained still, patient. No one moved. Not even the wind. Slowly, impossibly, Midnight's muzzle touched Boone's open palm. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't violent either. It was unsure, like touching a photograph of someone you used to know. The moment it happened, a collective gasp rippled through the arena like a wave. Even Sheriff McCorkle muttered, "Holy hell!" And Silas, his face stiffened, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. There was something in his gaze now that wasn't anger. It was fear. He turned to the man beside him, whispered something sharp and quick. No one noticed. No one cared. All eyes were still on Boone and Midnight. But Silas was already calculating, rewriting the rules of his own game. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about control. And Boone had just broken the story Silas spent years building. Midnight didn't pull away. He stood there, chest rising and falling, eyes softening just slightly. Boone didn't smile. He didn't speak. But something in him, something that had been locked away for years, shifted. Midnight had remembered. Or forgiven. Maybe both. But just as Boone opened his mouth to speak for the first time, a loud crack echoed from the gate behind them. Something metal. Something wrong. And suddenly, Midnight's head snapped up. The fear came back, fast, hard, and wild. The crack echoed like a rifle shot, sharp and wrong. Midnight reared up instantly, his front legs slicing through the air, eyes wide with panic. Boone stepped back on instinct, boots skidding in the dust. The chain that had kept one of the corral gates secured now dangled uselessly, snapped or, maybe, cut. No one saw who did it, but the sound had shattered everything. The crowd gasped, some even rising from their seats. Panic moved through them like a wave of electricity. Midnight backed into the far side of the pen, snorting, stomping, wild again. That fragile thread between man and beast was gone in a heartbeat. Boone looked toward the gate, jaw clenched. He knew what panic felt like. He'd lived through worse, but this felt orchestrated, deliberate. And Silas wasn't even looking at the horse. He was staring at Boone, arms crossed, lips tight, like a man who'd lit a match and was waiting for the flames to rise. Boone's eyes scanned the fence line, then locked onto a figure near the equipment shed. Someone in a dark coat, walking away too quickly, head down. He didn't recognize the face, but the body language was enough. Silas had plants everywhere. Boone had underestimated how far the man was willing to go. This wasn't about a bet. Not anymore. It was about keeping something buried. And Boone, just by stepping into that ring, had started digging. Midnight kicked at the fence with violent power, his panic rising by the second. His breaths came in sharp, thunderous bursts. Boone raised both hands slowly, trying to speak over the chaos in the stallion's mind. "Easy, boy. I'm not gonna hurt you." But the connection was broken. Midnight didn't hear him now. Whatever trust had flickered was buried beneath layers of instinct and fear. Boone swallowed hard. This wasn't just a frightened animal. This was trauma resurfacing. And Boone recognized it because it was the same storm inside him. In the stands, Odessa clutched the railing with white knuckles. Her voice shook. Why would someone do that? Silas didn't answer. He just turned to one of his men, gave a subtle nod. Moments later, the loudspeaker crackled to life. "That's enough. Everyone clear the area." It was a forced order, wrapped in false concern. Sheriff McCorkle didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Silas now, suspicion growing in the cracks of his frown. Boone didn't leave. He stood his ground while the dust swirled and Midnight crashed around the pen like a ghost hunted by fire. Boone's voice was calm but cold. "He remembers." No one responded. No one needed to. Because deep down, Boone had remembered something too, something awful. Midnight wasn't just scared. He was triggered. And that meant one terrifying truth. Someone had hurt him before. Boone stood in the arena long after the others had stepped away. Dust clung to his boots, sweat rolled down his back, and Midnight paced in circles like a prisoner relearning the size of his cell. The brief connection they'd shared was gone, but something lingered in the air. Boone could feel it like an old scar throbbing before a storm. Midnight wasn't just wild. He was trained to fear. That kind of broken didn't happen by accident. He'd seen it before. Horses that flinched at shadows, reacted to the sound of metal, went silent at a raised hand. Boone squinted across the arena at Midnight's flank, and that's when he saw it, the outline of a scar, almost hidden beneath the black sheen of his coat. Thin, but long, like it had been made with precision. Not a barbed wire wound. Not a fall. A whip. And not the kind used by rodeo cowboys. Boone's jaw tightened. That scar told a story no one in the crowd seemed ready to hear. Back in the stands, Silas Delacroix lit a cigar with a slow, practiced hand. But his eyes didn't match the calm exterior. He watched Boone like a chess master watching a piece shift without being touched. Silas didn't want Boone in that arena. Boone wasn't part of the show. Boone asked questions with his silence, and people were starting to listen. Odessa sat beside him, still watching Boone with quiet intensity. She leaned toward her grandfather and asked, "Did you hurt that horse?" Silas didn't answer. His smile returned, but his hand trembled ever so slightly as he took another drag. Sheriff McCorkle had seen enough. He stepped down from the bleachers, boots crunching over gravel as he made his way toward the edge of the arena. He wasn't ready to accuse anyone yet, but the look on his face was one of a man who just remembered something important. Something he should have noticed years ago. He called out to Boone, "You all right?" Boone didn't answer right away. He knelt down, picking up a piece of the broken chain that had fallen during the earlier chaos. It wasn't worn out, it had been cut. Clean. Precise. Boone stood and nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. But that horse ain't." Midnight had stopped pacing. He stood at the far end of the arena, watching Boone. Breathing hard, body trembling, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. Boone stepped closer again, slower this time, almost as if asking permission. Midnight didn't move away, didn't flinch. That told Boone more than words ever could. Pain remembers pain. And in that moment, man and animal stood across from each other not as strangers, but as survivors. The sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the red dirt. Boone spoke under his breath, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. He was beaten, and someone made damn sure he stayed quiet. And just like that, the truth started to crack the surface. Ugly, slow, and impossible to ignore. Boone sat alone on the split-rail fence long after the arena cleared out. The last rays of sun painted the dust in bronze streaks, and Midnight stood still near the center, head lowered, as if exhausted by something deeper than fatigue. Boone watched him in silence, turning the chain link over in his hand. It was smooth, cold, and too clean on one side, like it had been cut with a bolt tool, not broken by force. A message, maybe. Or a warning. Either way, someone wanted him to back off. But Boone had never been good at doing what he was told. He remembered a night long ago, smoke pouring out of a burning barn, his boots slipping on soaked hay, Dusty's voice screaming from somewhere inside. And then silence. The kind that never left. That same silence echoed now, in this moment, between him and the horse that seemed to carry his son's name in its eyes. Boone shook his head, trying to dispel the thought, but it clung to him like ash. Midnight wasn't just scared of people. He was scared of a kind of person. The kind who saw power in pain. Inside the viewing lounge above the arena, Silas Delacroix sipped from a glass of aged bourbon and stared down at the ring like a king watching his kingdom falter. His face was stone, but his hands betrayed him, tapping the glass, twitching just slightly at the knuckles. He'd built this place on stories, on fear, on control. Midnight was never supposed to be touched, never supposed to connect. He was the myth that kept the powerful in charge and the curious far away. But now Boone had cracked something open, and Silas knew how fast legends could fall when truth leaked in. Down by the stables, Odessa had followed Boone quietly, her small boots crunching gravel. "My grandfather says the horse is dangerous," she said softly. Boone didn't look at her, but his voice was calm. "He's not dangerous. He's remembering." Odessa took a step closer. "I think he trusts you." "Why?" Boone finally turned to her, his eyes dark, tired. "Because we were both broken by the same kind of man. The kind who smiles while he hurts you." As the wind picked up, a barn door creaked somewhere in the distance, and Midnight raised his head sharply. Boone noticed it, that instinctual reaction, and followed his gaze toward a small structure at the edge of the property. A locked shed. One Boone had never noticed before. A cold shiver worked its way down his spine. Horses don't fear sheds, unless they remember what happened inside one. Boone stood, dusted off his jeans, and handed Odessa the broken chain. "Keep this. Might come in handy later." She looked up at him, confused. He didn't explain. He just walked toward the shed, slow and steady. And for the first time in years, Boone felt something old rising in his chest. Not anger, not fear. Something worse. Recognition. The shed sat crooked at the far end of the property, half swallowed by weeds and shadows. Boone approached slowly, the dry grass crunching beneath his boots. The place wasn't on any of the ranch maps. No signs, no locks on the outside, just a rusted chain looped around the handles and a padlock that looked old enough to lie. Midnight, now far behind in the arena, watched him. Boone didn't turn back. Some truths waited years to be found. Others waited in silence, daring you to open the door. Boone pulled a flathead screwdriver from his back pocket, old habit, and jimmied the lock with steady hands. The snap of the shackle breaking echoed louder than expected. He slipped inside, blinking against the sudden darkness. The air was thick with the sour scent of mildew and sweat. And beneath it, something else. Something coppery. Boone knew that smell. Blood. Not fresh. Not recent. But present. His stomach clenched. The shed wasn't empty. Against the back wall stood a rack of tools. Whips, muzzles, ropes with frayed ends. Not the kind used for rodeos. These were meant for punishment, not training. Boone's breath caught as his eyes landed on a wide wooden stock with rusted metal clasps. He stepped closer, reached out, and ran a hand over the cracked wood. There were marks on it, scratches. Deep ones. From hooves. From struggle. From terror. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, all he could hear was Dusty screaming again. But this time, it wasn't just a memory. It was parallel pain. In one corner, he found a tattered binder coated in dust. Inside, photos. Dozens of them. Horses, chained, bruised, eyes filled with something Boone didn't have a word for. Some of the photos had names scribbled underneath in a sharp, all-caps hand. One name caught his eye. Midnight, Stage 4 Response. Boone's mouth went dry. It wasn't a name, it was a file. A classification. The horse wasn't just mistreated. He'd been part of something. Studied. Tested. Conditioned. Boone stumbled back, breathing hard. The pieces started to come together. Silas hadn't just bet on an untouchable horse. He'd created one. And whatever had happened here, it was meant to be erased. Forgotten. But they hadn't counted on Midnight surviving. And they sure as hell hadn't counted on Boone Casket showing up with enough guilt in his bones to dig through hell for justice. Back outside, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving only a dull orange sky and a wind that whistled through the dry trees like a warning. Boone stepped out of the shed, holding the binder tight under his arm. From the arena, Midnight let out a sound Boone had only heard once before. A long, low, broken whinny that sounded almost human. And Boone knew the past wasn't dead. It was waiting. Boone walked straight toward the main house with the binder under his arm like it was a loaded weapon. His boots kicked up dust, but his steps were steady, too steady. People noticed. Conversations around the stables hushed. A few of Silas's ranch hands watched him pass, exchanging glances, uncertain whether they should stop him. But no one moved. Maybe they knew. Maybe they'd always known, deep down, but looked away. Now, someone had looked directly into the fire, and come back with proof. Inside the house, Silas was pouring himself another drink when Boone walked in without knocking. The screen door slapped shut behind him like a gavel. Silas didn't flinch. "You must be lost," he said without looking up. "The help entrance is out back." Boone dropped the binder on the table between them. It landed with a dull, solid thud, the sound of buried sins resurfacing. Silas's eyes narrowed. He reached for the binder, but Boone placed a firm hand on top of it. "I know what you did," Boone said, voice low but sharp. "And now I think half the town will too." Silas chuckled, a dry, lifeless sound. "You think anyone cares what an old horseman says about some bruises on a wild animal?" He leaned in, smug. "This is Texas, Casket. People don't cry over livestock." But Boone didn't blink. "You didn't just hurt him. You engineered his pain. Labeled it. photographed it, sold it. That makes you worse than a man with a whip. That makes you something else entirely. For the first time, Silas's confidence cracked. Just slightly. He leaned back, jaw tight. "You're bluffing," he muttered. Boone opened the binder, flipped to the photo labeled Stage 4 Response, Midnight, and laid it on the table like a verdict. Silas stared at it in silence. Boone added, "You don't get to pretend this didn't happen. Not anymore. He remembers. And now, so does everyone else." Outside, a small crowd had gathered near the porch. Sheriff McCorkle stood near the fence, arms crossed, Odessa beside him. Whispers traveled fast in towns like this, and the truth moved even faster when it carried the weight of cruelty. McCorkle stepped up onto the deck. "We done talkin' in circles, boys? Or do I need to start askin' legal questions?" Silas didn't answer. Boone didn't move. Midnight's soft whinny carried from the arena. Calm, even. Like he knew what was happening. Boone turned to the sheriff. "I've got enough to bury him in lawsuits, and maybe worse. But I didn't come for vengeance. I came for the horse." McCorkle nodded slowly, then looked at Silas. "Then maybe it's time we take a little walk, and you tell me exactly what you've been doing in that shed." Silas didn't speak. He just sat there, silent, small, and suddenly very human. The morning after the confrontation, the ranch felt like a different place. The usual buzz of workers and machinery was gone, replaced by an uneasy quiet. Boone sat on the edge of the arena fence, staring at Midnight, who now stood untethered inside the round pen. No ropes, no chains, just dirt, space, and air. The stallion wasn't pacing. He wasn't agitated. He was still, like he was waiting for something, or someone. Boone hadn't slept. The binder was still in his truck, and Sheriff McCorkle had promised a full investigation. Silas had been forced to step away for health reasons, but everyone knew it was more than that. His empire, built on fear and reputation, had started to rot from the inside. But Boone didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow, like after the fire all over again. Only this time, it wasn't his son he couldn't save. It was the reflection of that pain standing on four legs just a few yards away. Odessa walked up beside him, holding a weathered leather halter in her small hands. "He lets me touch him now," she said softly. "Yesterday he let me brush him. He didn't even flinch." Boone looked at her, saw the innocence still clinging to her despite the shadows around her family name. He nodded slowly. "That's because you don't want anything from him. You're not trying to fix him. You're just there." She handed Boone the halter. "He'll follow you," she said. "You know he will." Boone stared at it for a long moment. Dust coated the edges, and the brass buckles had tarnished. He hadn't held a halter since Dusty's died. His hand shook as he took it. In that moment, Boone realized he wasn't afraid of Midnight. He was afraid of what he represented. Loss, memory, survival. The kind of pain that doesn't kill you, but changes who you are. Boone stepped into the pen. Midnight raised his head, ears alert, but didn't move away. Boone didn't speak. He didn't reach out yet. He just stood there, open, vulnerable, letting the silence speak louder than words. Slowly, he lifted the halter. Midnight blinked, shifted his weight, then stepped forward. One step, then another. Boone felt the sting behind his eyes before he knew what it was. Midnight stopped in front of him, and didn't run. The leather slid gently over the stallion's head. Boone clipped the buckle shut with a trembling breath. The past didn't vanish in that moment. The scars were still there, but the weight of them shifted, like they didn't belong only to Midnight anymore. Boone held the lead rope loosely and whispered, "Let's go home." Midnight didn't resist. He followed. Not because he was broken, but because he'd finally been heard. The trailer door creaked shut behind them as Boone latched it with quiet hands. Midnight stood calmly inside, no longer the wild-eyed animal from days before. His breathing was steady, his eyes soft. Boone rested a hand on the side of the trailer and let out a long breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Odessa stood nearby, her eyes glassy. She didn't say much, just gave Boone a small nod, the kind that means more than words. He returned it, climbed into his old pickup, and started the engine. They didn't take the highway. Boone drove backroads, long, winding stretches of dirt and memory. He passed fields that used to be green and houses that looked smaller than they did in his youth. With each mile, the weight on his shoulders got lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because he'd finally stopped running from it. Midnight stood quietly in the trailer behind him. No rattling, no panic. Two survivors sharing silence like a language only they spoke. By midday, they reached the old property. Boone hadn't been back since the fire. The main house was gone. The barn was just skeletal beams and caved-in wood. But the land still breathed. Wild grass had grown over the ashes. Fence posts leaned, and the wind moved through them like a song half forgotten. Boone opened the trailer gate. Midnight stepped out, slow and careful, nostrils flaring as he took in the place. He didn't bolt. He just stood beside Boone, as if waiting for permission to feel safe. Boone walked him out to the field, unclipped the lead, and stepped back. Midnight stayed where he was, his head turning toward the horizon, ears twitching. Then, without a sound, he began to walk. Not to escape. Not to flee. Just to move, like a man taking his first step after a long recovery. Boone watched him, eyes burning again. Not with grief this time, but with release. Not everything had been lost. Not everyone had stayed broken. Behind him, the wind shifted, carrying a familiar scent, dry dirt, grass, and something else. Hope, maybe. Sheriff McCorkle had promised to keep the case open. Silas would face the consequences, eventually. But Boone didn't need justice to feel whole. What he needed was standing free in an open field, finally unafraid of the world. Midnight looked back once, just for a moment, and Boone nodded. That was all either of them needed. As the sun dipped low over the hills, Boone sat on the old porch steps of what used to be home. Midnight grazed nearby, peaceful and whole in a way that couldn't be measured. And for the first time in years, Boone didn't feel haunted. He felt still. Not because the past was gone, but because he'd chosen to live beyond it.